The first time I realized something was wrong, a sheriff's deputy showed up at my door with a serious look and a stack of papers, claiming I was trespassing in my own neighborhood. My heart sank as I scanned the documents, warnings, threats, fines, all from the HOA. I couldn't believe it. They were trying to have me arrested for walking onto my own property. But what they didn't know would change everything. I wasn't just any homeowner. I held a position of authority that no HOA could challenge. How far would they go before discovering the truth? And what would happen the moment they did? When I first moved into Willow Creek Estates, it felt like a dream. The streets were lined with perfectly manicured lawns, flowering hedges, and homes painted in cheerful, inviting colors. It wasn't just a neighborhood. It was the kind of place people boasted about on social media. It's a kind of community where kids rode bikes safely and neighbors waved from their driveways. I'd spent years saving for this home, a modest two-story house on a quiet corner lot just at the edge of the HOA's reach. I loved the freedom of living near a community without being fully under its thumb, at least. That's what I thought. For months, life was simple. Mornings started with coffee on the porch, sunlight spilling across the freshly planted flower beds. I'd watch neighbors walk their dogs, exchange polite nods and smiles, and feel a sense of belonging I hadn't known in years. There was a rhythm to the days that felt comforting, a kind of suburban serenity that made it easy to forget the outside world. But every neighborhood has its rules, written and unwritten, and Willow Creek was no exception. I noticed the HOA patrols occasionally, a woman in a crisp polo shirt, clipboard in hand, pacing yards and photographing mailboxes. Her name was Karen, though I didn't know it yet. At first, I shrugged it off, assuming she was just maintaining community standards. Her presence seemed distant, almost ceremonial, something that had nothing to do with me. Then came the first subtle signs of intrusion. A note tucked under my mailbox warning about non-compliant landscaping. A neighbor commenting that my driveway looked different from the standard. Whispers that stopped mid-sentence when I approached. Small, almost laughable things, but they hinted at a deeper obsession, the kind of control that wasn't satisfied with just rules on paper. The subtle tension grew each day, like an invisible weight pressing on the edges of my life. I didn't yet understand that this HOA had a reach far beyond what I'd imagined, and that the line between harmless oversight and harassment could blur faster than I was ready for. Before I knew it, a single misstep, or even just the perception of one, would set off a chain reaction that no one, not even me, could have predicted at first. I tried to ignore the warnings, convincing myself that they were just overzealous notes from someone taking their job too seriously. After all, my home wasn't officially part of the HOA, but the moment I woke up one morning to find an orange notice taped to my front door, everything changed. Immediate compliance required, it read in bold letters. The accusations were absurd: the mailbox color, the height of my hedges, even the type of mulch in my flower beds. My driveway was supposedly not. I stared at it, incredulous. How could anyone enforce rules on a property that wasn't theirs? I called the HOA number on the notice, hoping for clarification or at least a polite apology. Instead, a clipped voice responded, "All properties within the perimeter must adhere to community standards." The line went dead. My stomach sank. What had begun as a minor nuisance was suddenly taking a threatening turn. Within days, the notes multiplied. Some were formal, stamped with the HOA letterhead. Others were hastily handwritten, scrawled in urgent, almost aggressive script. Each one made the same demands: change this, remove that, comply immediately, or face consequences. The fines started piling up, small amounts at first, then hundreds of dollars, and finally letters claiming thousands in penalties. They weren't legally binding, but the pressure was relentless. I tried to reason with them in writing. I photocopied my property deed, explained politely that their rules didn't apply to me, and mailed it certified. Days later, I discovered my trash cans had been tipped over, my flower beds trampled, and a handwritten note left under the lid. "You think you're above the rules?" That's when I realized this wasn't about rules anymore. It was about power, Karen's power and her obsession with control. She escalated quickly. One morning, I saw her pacing at the edge of my lawn, clipboard in hand, taking photos of my house. When I stepped outside to confront her, she didn't flinch. Her voice was low, but venomous. "You'll regret this." Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The message was clear. She would stop at nothing. The situation worsened with neighbors. Once friendly faces became cold or avoided me entirely. Conversations ended abruptly when I approached. Even people who had been neutral seemed intimidated, whispering about me behind closed doors. Karen had woven a network of influence and fear that reached every corner of the community by the second month. The harassment had become almost unbearable. Certified letters arrived daily, demanding compliance and threatening property seizure. The HOA even held a community meeting, sending me a printed invitation with the words "attendance mandatory." I hesitated. I wasn't a member, but curiosity, or perhaps defiance, got the better of me. When I arrived, the room fell silent. Karen sat at the head of the polished conference table, clipboard in front of her, flanked by her board members. She began reading from her notes, listing my so-called violations one by one. Every accusation was petty, trivial, and absurd, yet presented with the force of someone who believed the world would bend to her will. My hands clenched at my sides, heart pounding, as I realized she intended to publicly shame me in front of the neighbors she'd rallied. After the meeting, the intimidation didn't stop. My car tires were slashed one night with no note, no witness. The police were sympathetic, but limited in what they could do without concrete evidence. My mailbox was tampered with, packages went missing, and more threatening letters appeared, warning that corrective action would be taken if I didn't comply. Even friends who had once offered support whispered cautiously. Afraid to cross Karen, I began documenting everything: photos, videos, timestamps, copies of all letters. I installed a small camera to capture activity around the mailbox and driveway. It was the only way to prove what was happening. And it worked. Within days, the camera caught Karen herself opening my mailbox and slipping in a note, scribbled thickly in red ink: "We'll seize you by force if we have to." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. A car passing by, the rustle of leaves, even the wind. The fear was real, but beneath it was something else, a growing determination. I realized that this wasn't just about my house anymore. This was about refusing to let fear dictate my life. Karen had underestimated me, assumed I would cower like everyone else. She was wrong. I consulted my attorney, who laughed at the audacity of the HOA's claims, but also encouraged me to prepare for escalation. Together, we began filing the necessary documents, restraining orders, harassment claims, and evidence for potential legal action. It was a painstaking process, but every form and time-stamped photo strengthened my case. One evening, while reviewing the footage, I noticed something new, a pattern in the board members' behavior. Karen wasn't acting alone. She had allies willing to support her, even when they knew what she was doing was wrong. But they were also human, and human beings crumble under scrutiny. I realized that with enough evidence and pressure, even her loyal followers might break. Then came the final provocation. A note appeared under my door, sealed with an official HOA stamp. "Final notice: failure to comply will result in property seizure." I stared at it for what felt like hours, anger building with every second. The audacity, the sheer arrogance of it. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was declaring war on anyone she saw as an outsider. And this time, I knew it was personal. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. A car passing by, the rustle of leaves, even the wind. The fear was real, but beneath it was something else, a growing determination. I realized that this wasn't just about my house anymore. This was about refusing to let fear dictate my life. Karen had underestimated me, assumed I would cower like everyone else. She was wrong. I consulted my attorney, who laughed at the audacity of the HOA's claims, but also encouraged me to prepare for escalation. Together, we began filing the necessary documents, restraining orders, harassment claims, and evidence for potential legal action. It was a painstaking process, but every form and time-stamped photo strengthened my case. One evening, while reviewing the footage, I noticed something new, a pattern in the board members' behavior. Karen wasn't acting alone. She had allies willing to support her, even when they knew what she was doing was wrong. But they were also human, and human beings crumble under scrutiny. I realized that with enough evidence and pressure, even her loyal followers might break. Then came the final provocation. A note appeared under my door, sealed with an official HOA stamp. Final notice: failure to comply will result in property seizure. I stared at it for what felt like hours, anger building with every second. The audacity, the sheer arrogance of it. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was declaring war on anyone she saw as an outsider. And this time, I knew it was personal. I decided I would no longer wait for them to make the next move. I started preparing my own counterattack, collecting every piece of evidence, documenting every violation of law or trespassing act. I made a plan to confront the HOA formally, legally, and in a way that they could not ignore. By the time the night came when Karen and her followers tried to intimidate me once more, the tea was ready. Camera rolling, files in hand, evidence stacked and organized. I understood one thing clearly. The tables were about to turn. The homeowner they had tried to crush was no longer afraid. And just like that, the tension that had been building for months reached a breaking point. The next encounter would be the one that changed everything. Where fear, control, and obsession would collide with truth, authority, and justice. The day of the formal HOA tribunal arrived with an uneasy quiet that seemed to hang over the neighborhood like a storm cloud. I parked at the edge of the boardroom lot, my evidence folder resting heavily in my hands, each page a testament to months of harassment, intimidation, and absurd rules enforced outside their jurisdiction. Karen was already inside, seated at the head of the polished conference table, clipboard open, pen tapping impatiently. Her posture was perfect, shoulders back, chin high, exuding the confidence of someone who had controlled this neighborhood for years. I, however, was calm. Every step I had taken, every document I had filed, every photo and video I had captured had led to this moment. As I entered the room, a hush fell. The board members shifted uneasily, some glancing at Karen with what I recognized as silent hesitation. She greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that masked frustration with forced poise. "We're here to discuss the repeated violations of community standards by your property," she said, voice crisp and unyielding. I set my folder on the table and opened it. Each document, meticulously organized, told a story of trespassing, threats, and harassment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply slid the first stack toward her. Photos of her on my property. Video stills capturing her tampering with my mailbox. Copies of the threatening letters she had sent. The room's energy shifted instantly, tension thick and tangible. Karen leaned forward, scanning the papers. Her smirk faltered ever so slightly. This doesn't mean anything," she said. Though the tremor in her voice betrayed her, I continued calmly, detailing each incident. "This isn't enforcement. This is harassment, trespassing, threats of violence. Actions that, under state law, are illegal. I placed a final document on top, a certified restraining order already approved by the court. And this, I said, prohibits you from coming within 500 feet of my property. Not suggestions. A legal mandate. For a moment, Karen froze. Her carefully constructed world, built on intimidation, fear, and control, began to crumble in real time. The other board members exchanged quick, uneasy glances, some nodding ever so slightly, as if acknowledging a truth they had ignored for too long. You can't do this," she sputtered, voice cracking. "This community is mine to protect." But it was clear to everyone present that the tables had turned. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was someone who knew the law, someone who had the evidence, and someone who refused to be cowed. I remained calm, placing the final photos and notes neatly in a pile. "Protection doesn't include harassment," I said. "Authority doesn't grant immunity from the law." Her eyes darted around the room, seeking support, but no one met her gaze. One of the quieter board members, previously loyal, finally spoke. "Karen, this is serious. We can't condone this behavior." The tension in the room was electric. Karen's face, usually so composed, was now a storm of disbelief, fear, and desperation. She stood abruptly, pointing a finger at me, trembling. "You think you've won? You're just an outsider. We'll make you regret this." I did nothing. I simply looked back steadily. Every document, every video, every photo had spoken louder than threats ever could. The shift was palpable. The other members, once silent witnesses, began whispering to one another, heads shaking. The power Karen had wielded for years evaporated in that moment. She was no longer the queen of the neighborhood. She was exposed, vulnerable, and cornered. Then, as if on cue, the doors opened. The same police officer who had dismissed my early complaints stepped inside, professional and unflinching. "We've reviewed the evidence," he said quietly but firmly. "All harassment claims are verified. The restraining order is valid. Any further attempts to intimidate this homeowner will result in immediate legal action." Karen's face went pale. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, a soundless gasp. The kind that betrays a loss of control unlike anything she had ever faced. She collapsed back into her chair, eyes wide, staring at the evidence, at the officer, at the room that now no longer obeyed her. I gathered my folder, remaining composed, and stood. Every neighbor who had witnessed her antics, every board member who had previously followed blindly, now watched as the woman who had ruled this community with fear was stripped of her authority. The humiliation was public, undeniable, and utterly irreversible. Even as I stepped toward the exit, I noticed the subtle gestures, a nod from one neighbor, a quiet murmur of agreement from another. They had seen it too. They had witnessed the collapse of someone who had built a kingdom on control, only to see it undone by evidence, law, and quiet determination. Outside, the night was calm. The streetlights cast long shadows, the kind that emphasized the surrealness of the moment. Karen remained behind, flustered, disbelieving, a woman confronted with the limits of her own power. I walked down the steps, folder in hand, camera running to document everything, knowing that this moment, the apex of months of harassment, would define the story. But the confrontation didn't end quietly. 2 nights later, headlights illuminated my house. Karen stood outside, shouting threats into the night, her voice echoing across the cul-de-sac. The neighbors, for the first time, didn't flinch or hide. They watched, some recording, some calling the police. The authority she had once commanded through fear was gone. She was exposed, and her power was meaningless in the face of truth and evidence. As the patrol car arrived and Karen was escorted away, her rage and disbelief palpable, I stood on my porch and exhaled. Months of anxiety, threats, and harassment had led to this exact moment. Vindication. A triumph not just over an overreaching HOA, but over the fear and intimidation that had held the neighborhood captive for too long. Yet, even as the adrenaline faded, I knew the aftermath would be complex. Karen's fall was public, but the neighborhood was still fragile. The real work of rebuilding trust, restoring community, and ensuring such abuse of power never happened again was just beginning. And in that quiet moment, standing under the soft glow of the streetlights, I realized something essential. Sometimes the true battle isn't just about winning. It's about standing firm, documenting the truth, and letting justice, not anger, speak louder than anyone ever thought possible. As the camera continued recording, capturing the empty street and the fading taillights, I knew one thing with certainty: the story wasn't over. The resolution would be satisfying, but the lessons of power, fear, and the courage to confront both would linger far longer than anyone anticipated. The days after the tribunal felt surreal, like walking through a dream where everything familiar suddenly looked different. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood for months, thick as fog, began to lift. Karen was no longer a looming presence. Her clipboard sat abandoned on the table, a symbol of her failed attempts to control what she could not own. The HOA board, once complicit in her petty power plays, now scrambled to repair a credibility that had been shattered in front of the entire community. I returned to my home, the house that had been both my sanctuary and my battlefield, and took a long, deep breath. For weeks, I had measured each step, watched each shadow, and cataloged every threat. Now, for the first time in months, the porch felt like mine again. I could step outside without checking over my shoulder, listen to the wind in the trees without anticipating harassment, and watch neighbors go about their lives without a cloud of fear hanging between us. The HOA's response to the tribunal was swift, though not particularly graceful. Karen was relieved of all HOA duties, and several board members quietly resigned, unwilling to be associated with the scandal that had exposed the organization's overreach. The remaining board members issued public apologies, promising reforms and the establishment of clearer boundaries between residents' rights and the HOA's authority. While some of the promises were performative, the momentum for change had been set, and for the first time in years, there was genuine hope that the neighborhood could function without fear. News of the tribunal spread quickly. Local blogs and community forums picked up the story, sharing photos and accounts of the hearing. My confrontation became a point of discussion. Neighbors speculated about the audacity of an outsider standing up to a powerful HOA, and many expressed quiet admiration for the courage it took to document and confront months of harassment. I received messages from people in other neighborhoods, recounting similar experiences and thanking me for setting an example. For many, the story was validation that one person's refusal to submit to abuse could catalyze change and shine a light on injustice. Despite the victory, the aftermath was not without its challenges. Some neighbors remained wary, hesitant to speak freely or engage with me directly. The memory of months of tension lingered, manifesting in brief glances, hushed conversations, and a subtle undercurrent of suspicion. Rebuilding trust, I realized, would take as much patience and persistence as fighting the initial harassment. But small victories began to accumulate. A neighbor waved with a genuine smile. Another stopped by to compliment my restored garden. And slowly, the sense of community returned in my own life. The experience had left indelible marks. The adrenaline and fear of the confrontation had been replaced with a deep-seated sense of empowerment. I had faced a system designed to intimidate and control, and I had emerged not only unbroken, but stronger. Every photo, every video, every meticulously organized folder of evidence was a reminder that preparation, calm strategy, and unwavering resolve can overcome even the most audacious displays of authority. I, Also realized that Karen's obsession with control had been a symptom of a broader pattern. The HOA's reach, the petty fines, and the enforcement of trivial rules were not isolated incidents. They were manifestations of a mindset that equates power with compliance, authority with fear. Witnessing her downfall was not merely personal vindication. It was a lesson in the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of holding systems accountable. Life in the neighborhood gradually returned to a sense of normalcy. Gardens flourished without interference, mailboxes remained intact, and community gatherings became spaces for genuine conversation rather than subtle intimidation. I planted a new row of wildflowers along the edge of my lawn, vibrant reds, yellows, and purples spilling onto the curb. They were more than decoration. They were a symbol of reclaiming space, asserting presence, and celebrating the small freedoms that had been threatened for so long. Months later, I received a note slipped under my door. No return address, no name, just a single line of handwritten text. Thank you for standing up. Some of us were too scared to. The anonymity of the sender made it all the more powerful. It reminded me that the battle had not been mine alone. By standing firm, I had given others the courage to confront injustice, to recognize their rights, and to reclaim agency in their own lives. The HOA, under new management and with reformed guidelines, gradually transformed from an oppressive force into a community organization with boundaries. The rules were simplified, fines were reconsidered, and residents were encouraged to personalize their homes without fear of retaliation. It was not perfect, but the culture of intimidation had been broken. Where once there had been fear, now there was cautious optimism. Where once there had been whispers and suspicion, now there was laughter, conversation, and even a tentative sense of unity. For me personally, the experience reshaped my understanding of power, control, and resilience. I had learned that the threat of authority is often more frightening than authority itself, and that the key to overcoming intimidation lies in preparation, documentation, and the courage to act decisively. Each step, from photographing the mailbox to attending the tribunal fully prepared, had been a lesson in strategy, patience, and emotional fortitude. Reflecting on the ordeal, I realized that the true victory was not in punishing Karen or humiliating the HOA. The real triumph lay in reclaiming my life, my peace of mind, and my community. By standing firm, I had ensured that fear no longer dictated the rhythm of daily life for myself or my neighbors. The lessons were clear. Unchecked power must be challenged. Silence in the face of harassment is complicity, and courage, even quiet. Measured courage can topple the most daunting of obstacles, even now. When I walk through the neighborhood, the experience resonates. I see families playing in yards, neighbors chatting on porches, and a community slowly returning to its human rhythm. Each moment is a reminder of what can be accomplished when one refuses to submit to fear, when one documents, prepares, and confronts injustice with calm determination. The HOA that once loomed as a shadow over our lives is now a cautionary tale, a story of power undone, and a testament to the strength of standing up for what is right. And sometimes, the most profound victories aren't those marked by headlines or legal documents. Sometimes they are the quiet, personal triumphs, the ability to enjoy your own porch without anxiety, the freedom to tend your garden without interference, and the knowledge that you refuse to be intimidated. These victories linger long after the legal battles end, shaping both the community and oneself in ways that matter far more than any penalty or reprimand ever could. Asterisk. As the sun sets over Willow Creek, it's casting a warm glow over vibrant lawns and the wildflowers I planted along the curb, I feel a sense of completion. The conflict is over, the neighborhood is healing, and the lessons remain etched in memory. Karen's shadow has lifted, and in its place is a community that knows the limits of authority and the power of resilience. In the end, The story isn't just about a homeowner versus an HOA. It's about courage, preparation, and the refusal to let fear dictate life. It's a reminder that standing firm, documenting the truth, and asserting your rights can change not just your own world, but the lives of those around you. And sometimes, the quiet act of living freely, in defiance of intimidation, is the most powerful statement of all.